The Clock's Secret Chime, Chapter 1. My father, Thomas, was a man of few words, his emotions often hidden beneath a quiet exterior. He wasn't one for grand gestures or effusive displays of affection, but his love for our family was the steady, unwavering rhythm of our lives. He was a clock enthusiast, his study filled with timepieces of all shapes and sizes, each one ticking and chiming, marking the passage of time in a comforting symphony. His prized possession, however, was the antique grandfather clock that stood in the hall, a beautiful, imposing piece that had been in our family for generations. After his passing, the house felt strangely silent. The absence of his quiet presence and the steady tick-tock of his beloved clocks, leaving a void that time could never truly fill. I'm Clara. I'm 60 years old now, a retired teacher, living a quiet life after my husband passed away a few years ago. My father's passing left me with the task of going through his belongings, of sorting through the remnants of a life lived fully and quietly. His study, filled with his clocks, felt like a sanctuary, the place where the echoes of his life were strongest. The grandfather clock in the hall was more than just a timepiece. It was a symbol of our family history, its deep chimes marking milestones and memories throughout the years. As I began the task of cleaning and maintaining the clock, a ritual my father performed with meticulous care, I noticed something unusual. Within the clock's base, behind a removable panel, was a small, intricately carved wooden compartment. It wasn't immediately obvious, cleverly concealed within the clock's structure. My heart gave a little jump. A hidden compartment in the grandfather clock? What secrets had my father kept hidden here? Within the very heart of our family's timepiece, with trembling hands, I gently opened the small wooden door of the compartment. Inside, nestled on a faded velvet lining, were a few precious items: a child's hand-drawn picture, folded and creased, a small tarnished metal whistle attached to a thin, worn string, and a folded piece of paper, an undated note in my father's familiar, steady handwriting. My breath hitched. A child's drawing, a whistle, my father's note, hidden away in the grandfather clock. I picked up the drawing first. It was clearly drawn by a young child with simple lines and bright faded colors. It depicted a sunny day, stick figures of people, balloons, and a large, colorful tent. At the bottom, in shaky, childlike letters, was a name: Leo. Leo, a child's name, a child's drawing. The scene, people, balloons, a tent. It looked like a fair or a carnival. Next, I picked up the whistle. It was small, made of tarnished metal, its surface worn smooth as if it had been held and used many times. It was a simple toy whistle, the kind a child might play with. Finally, I unfolded the note in my father's handwriting. It was undated, but the words were clear, filled with a quiet sorrow and a sense of something left unresolved. To whomever finds this compartment holds the memory of a child lost. Leo, the summer fair at Blackwood Mill, 1968. He disappeared. It changed everything. The truth. It was never spoken of. Buried by time, by pain, by the need to move on. But the mystery, it lingers. He was lost to us, or simply lost. The drawing was his, a whistle, he never let it go. If you find this, perhaps you can find the answers that eluded us. Find Leo, Thomas. My mind reeled. Leo, a child lost. The summer fair at Blackwood Mill, 1968. He disappeared. It changed everything. The truth never spoken of. Lost to us. Or simply lost. Find Leo. The summer fair at Blackwood Mill, 1968. I remembered the Blackwood Mill Fair from my childhood. A big annual event in our region, filled with rides, games, and crowds of people. 1968. I would have been around 8 years old then. I had vague memories of attending the fair, of the excitement, the noise, the smells of popcorn and cotton candy. But I had no memory of a child disappearing, of a tragedy connected to my family. Who was Leo? Was he a relative, a cousin, a sibling I never knew about? My parents had only me. My mother had no siblings. My father had one sister, Aunt Carol, who had passed away years ago and never married or had children. The drawing, the whistle, the note, they all pointed to a child named Leo lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. He was lost to us, or simply lost. This phrase, similar to the one in Aunt Carol's note in a previous story about a child lost in the flood, hinted at an uncertainty surrounding Leo's fate. Was he lost in the crowd and never found? Did something more sinister happen? Or did he survive but was somehow lost to the family, his whereabouts unknown? The truth, it was never spoken of. This suggested a deliberate silence, a secret kept by my family. Why? What was the secret surrounding Leo's disappearance? Why was his story buried, never spoken of? My father's quiet demeanor, his hidden emotions, the subtle sadness I had sometimes sensed in him. Was it the burden of this secret, of a child lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair whose fate remained a question mark? The grandfather clock, a symbol of our family history, held this devastating secret within its heart. Its steady ticking suddenly felt like a countdown to uncovering a truth that had been hidden for decades. A truth about a lost child, a secret event that had changed everything, and a lifetime of unspoken sorrow. I felt an overwhelming need to know who Leo was, what truly happened to him at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, why his disappearance was a secret, and whether lost to us meant gone forever or simply lost to the family. His life taking a different path, unaware of the family who had remembered him in secret for over 50 years. Chapter 2.1. The hidden compartment in the grandfather clock, the child's drawing, the tarnished whistle, and my father's cryptic note had unveiled a devastating family secret. A child named Leo disappeared at the Blackwood Mill Summer Fair in 1968, a disappearance that changed everything, and was subsequently buried in silence. My father's haunting uncertainty, lost to us, or simply lost, suggested that Leo's fate was not definitively known, that he might have survived, but been lost to the family in the chaos or the aftermath. Who was Leo? Was he a close relative, a cousin, a nephew? The lack of any obvious connection to a child named Leo in my immediate family history made his identity a central mystery. The secret nature of his disappearance, the truth, it was never spoken of, pointed towards a deliberate cover-up, a reason to conceal the events of that day from the world and from me. My father, Thomas, a man of few words, had carried this secret throughout his life, his quiet demeanor perhaps a reflection of the unspoken sorrow and the weight of this hidden burden. The grandfather clock, his most prized possession, held this devastating truth within its core. its steady ticking marking the passage of time over a secret that had been buried for decades. I knew I had to delve into the history of the Blackwood Mill Summer Fair of 1968 to uncover the story of Leo's disappearance, to understand the circumstances of that day, and to find any records that might shed light on what truly happened to him. I began by researching the history of the Blackwood Mill Summer Fair. It was a popular annual event, drawing crowds from all over the region. I looked for newspaper articles, local news reports, any documentation about the fair in 1968. I found articles promoting the fair, describing the attractions, the crowds. And then, a brief, somber article published shortly after the fair concluded. It mentioned a missing child, a search underway, but provided few details, no name. The lack of prominent coverage about a missing child felt unusual, even for that era, hinting at a potential effort to downplay or control the narrative. I searched for police reports, missing persons records from 1968 in the region. The records from that long ago were often incomplete, and sensitive cases, like missing children, were sometimes handled discreetly, without widespread public attention, especially if the family involved preferred privacy. I found a few missing persons reports from that year, but none that clearly matched the description of a young boy named Leo, who disappeared at the Blackwood Mill Fair. The secrecy surrounding Leo's disappearance, the truth, it was never spoken of, suggested that my family was actively involved in keeping his story hidden. Who else in my family might have known about Leo, about his disappearance, about the events of that day? My mother had passed away. My father's sister, Aunt Carol, was also gone. Were there other relatives, older cousins, aunts, uncles, who might have been present at the fair, who might have witnessed something, who might have been privy to the secret? I reached out to my older relatives, cousins who might have attended the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. They were children or teenagers at the time, their memories perhaps fragmented by time and the passage of years. They remembered the fair, the excitement, the crowds, but none of them recalled a child named Leo disappearing or any significant family tragedy happening at the fair. The silence surrounding Leo was profound, extending even to those who were present at the time. The child's drawing with the name Leo at the bottom and the small, tarnished whistle. These were tangible links to the lost child. The drawing depicted a fairground scene confirming the location. The whistle, was it a special whistle? Was it used for something specific, or just a beloved toy? I examined the whistle closely, looking for any distinguishing marks, any inscription, anything that might make it unique. It was a simple metal whistle, worn smooth with use. There was no inscription. It seemed like a common toy whistle. The drawing, however, with its childlike depiction of a fair, felt personal. It was a drawing made by Leo, a snapshot of his world. The possibility that Leo survived the disappearance, that he was found by someone, taken in, raised by another family. Unaware of his origins, unaware of the family who searched for him or grieved him, or kept his story hidden. This possibility, hinted at in my father's note, or simply lost, was a powerful and emotional one. I needed to find out more about missing children cases from 1968 in the region, about any efforts to locate unidentified children, about any records of children who were found alone and subsequently placed in foster care or adoption. The records from that era were often incomplete and subject to privacy regulations, making this a challenging search. The silence surrounding Leo's disappearance, the lack of information in official records and in family memories, suggested a deliberate effort to erase his story, to bury the truth of what happened at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. Why was his story such a guarded secret? What happened that day that changed everything and was never spoken of? Chapter 2.2: The Mystery of Leo's Disappearance at the Blackwood Mill Summer Fair in 1968. A secret buried by time and silence was proving incredibly difficult to unravel. A lack of information in official records and the apparent absence of the story from family memories hinted at a deliberate effort to conceal the truth of what happened that day. My father's note, with its haunting uncertainty and emphasis on a secret that was never spoken of, suggested a hidden narrative far more complex than a simple accident or getting lost in the crowd. Who was Leo? What was his connection to my family? Was he a cousin, a nephew, a sibling? The absence of any clear familial link to a child named Leo, born around the mid-1960s in our family history, added another layer of complexity to the mystery. The child's drawing and the worn whistle were the only tangible links to his existence, fragments of a life that was seemingly erased from our family story. I decided to focus my research on the Blackwood Mill Summer Fair of 1968 itself. Was there anything unusual about that fair? Any incidents reported beyond the vague mention of a missing child? I searched old newspaper archives again, looking for any articles related to the fair, any reports of disturbances, any details that might provide context to Leo's disappearance. I found articles about the fair's attractions, its popularity, the large crowds it drew, but there was no prominent coverage of a missing child tragedy. The brief mention in the one article felt almost deliberately understated. Buried within other fair news, the location of the fairgrounds at Blackwood Mill might hold clues. Was Blackwood Mill a specific place, perhaps with a history or a feature that could be relevant to a child's disappearance? I researched the history of Blackwood Mill and the surrounding area. Blackwood Mill was an old industrial site, no longer operational in 1968, but the grounds were used for community events like the fair. The area included open fields, wooded areas, and the remnants of the mill itself, perhaps with old buildings or machinery. Could Leo have wandered off into the woods or explored the abandoned mill buildings? Could he have had an accident in a less public area of the fairgrounds? My father's note, it changed everything, suggested that Leo's disappearance had a profound and lasting impact on our family. Why? What was the nature of that impact? Was it the grief of losing a child, or was it the burden of a secret, of knowing something that had to be kept hidden? The possibility that Leo was not a direct descendant of my immediate family, my parents, grandparents, but perhaps a child connected through a more distant relative, or even a child entrusted to my family's care for a time, felt increasingly plausible given the lack of a clear familial link and the secrecy surrounding his disappearance. I decided to try and find anyone who had a strong connection to the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, someone who worked there, a long-time resident of the area who might have a more detailed memory of the events of that day. I visited the town archives in the community nearest to the old Blackwood Mill site, looking for any records related to the fair, any lists of vendors, organizers, or participants. The records were sparse, reflecting the informal nature of community events from that era. However, I did find a list of local families who were involved in organizing the fair in 1968. Among the names, I recognized a few families who had distant connections to my own family, branches of the family tree that had spread out over the generations. Could Leo be connected to one of these families? Was he a child of one of my distant cousins? Was he visiting the fair with them? And his disappearance was a tragedy that affected both their family and mine, leading to a shared secret. The worn whistle from the hidden compartment. Could it be a unique item, perhaps given out at the fair? Or a specific type of whistle used for a particular purpose? I searched for information about vendors or attractions at the 1968 Blackwood Mill Fair, looking for anything that might relate to a child's whistle. The information was limited, but I found a few mentions of toy vendors and game booths that would have sold simple toys like whistles. The child's drawing of the fair, with the name Leo at the bottom, remained a poignant reminder of the lost child. It was a simple drawing, but it captured the essence of the fair: the people, the balloons, the tents. My father's note, "He was lost to us," or simply lost, continued to haunt me. Was he lost to our family forever, tragically perished at the fair? Or was he simply lost in a different way, found by others, raised in ignorance of his true identity, and the family who had grieved and kept his secret for over 50 years? The possibility of a hidden survivor, of a life lived in anonymity, was a powerful and emotional one. I felt a growing urgency to find answers, to understand the truth behind Leo's disappearance, to bring his story out of the shadows, and to potentially find the child who was lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. Chapter 3.1: The Search for Leo, the child lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, was a journey through a labyrinth of silence and faded memories. The lack of official records and the absence of the story from family narratives pointed towards a deliberate cover-up, a secret so profound that it was buried for decades. My father's note, with its haunting uncertainty and emphasis on a truth that was never spoken of, hinted at a hidden narrative far more complex than a simple accident. Who was Leo? What was his connection to my family? The lack of a clear familial link in our immediate family history made his identity a central mystery. The possibility that he was a child connected through a more distant relative, or even a child entrusted to my family's care, felt increasingly plausible. I decided to focus my research on families with distant connections to my own. Families who had lived in the region around Blackwood Mill in 1968. Families who might have attended the fair and experienced a tragedy that was subsequently kept secret. I used genealogical databases to trace the branches of my family tree that had spread out over the generations. Identifying families with the same surname or related surnames who lived in the Blackwood Mill area in the mid to late 1960s. This research yielded a number of potential connections, families who were distantly related to me and who lived in the region. I began to research these families, looking for any mention of a child named Leo, any records of a child born around the mid-1960s who might fit the description of the lost child. Simultaneously, I decided to explore the possibility of using DNA testing to find living relatives of Leo, or even Leo himself, if he was still alive. If Leo was indeed a member of one of these distant branches of my family, a DNA test could potentially reveal a match with him or with his descendants, providing a direct link to his story. I submitted my own DNA for analysis and also reached out to some of the older individuals from these distantly related families through genealogical websites, explaining my research into a family mystery connected to the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968 and a child who was lost, and asking if they would be willing to provide DNA samples as well to help unravel the mystery. While waiting for potential DNA matches, I continued to analyze the physical clues from the hidden compartment, the child's drawing, and the worn whistle. The drawing, a simple depiction of a fairground scene, felt like a personal memento, a snapshot of a happy day that ended in tragedy. The whistle, a common toy, yet worn smooth with use, suggested it was a beloved possession, a comfort to a child. The loss to us, or simply lost, in my father's note, continued to resonate with a sense of profound uncertainty about Leo's fate. Was he lost in the literal sense, his life tragically cut short? Or was he lost to the family, found and raised by others, unaware of his true identity? The possibility of a hidden survivor, of a life lived in anonymity, was a powerful and emotional one. I decided to revisit the site of the Blackwood Mill Fairgrounds. Although the fair was no longer held there, and the mill buildings were likely gone or in ruins, the land itself held the echoes of the past. I wanted to walk the grounds, to see the place where Leo was last seen, to perhaps find some physical clue, some tangible link to that day, or simply to connect with the place where the mystery began. Traveling to the old Blackwood Mill site, a place I had only vague memories of from childhood fairs, felt like a pilgrimage. The area was overgrown, the remnants of the mill buildings barely visible through the trees. The fairgrounds were now just open fields, bordered by woods. It was a quiet, desolate place, a stark contrast to the vibrant scene depicted in Leo's drawing. As I walked the grounds, I tried to imagine the fair as it was in 1968. The crowds, the noise, the excitement. I tried to picture a child, a little boy named Leo, playing, laughing, perhaps holding onto a worn whistle. And then, the moment he was gone, I walked towards the edge of the woods, the trees dark and imposing. Could he have wandered into the woods? Could something have happened there? The sense of mystery, of unspoken truth, was palpable in the quiet, overgrown fields. The land itself seemed to hold the secrets of that day, secrets buried beneath decades of growth and silence. I didn't find any physical clues, any tangible remnants of the fair or of Leo's presence there. But I connected with the place, with the weight of its history, with the sense of a life that was tragically interrupted, a story that was deliberately silenced. The search for Leo, for the truth behind his disappearance, felt more urgent than ever. The possibility that he was still out there, a lost member of my family, living a life unaware of his origins, was a driving force. The alternative, that he perished at the fair, his story buried by silence, was a heartbreaking one, but one I needed to understand, to bring his story out of the shadows. To honor the memory of the child who was lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. Chapter 3.2. The journey to the Blackwood Mill Fairgrounds, while not yielding tangible clues, deepened my connection to the mystery of Leo's disappearance and strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth. The quiet, desolate fields, once filled with the vibrant energy of a summer fair, now held the palpable weight of a past tragedy and a secret buried for decades. My father's note, with its haunting uncertainty, and the child's drawing and worn whistle remained the only tangible links to the lost child. My research into the distantly related families in the Blackwood Mill area, families who might have a connection to Leo, continued. I was casting a wide net, searching for any familial link, any potential connection that might shed light on Leo's identity and his presence at the fair in 1968. The DNA samples from my older, distantly related cousins, provided through genealogical websites, were being processed. A DNA match could potentially reveal a direct link to Leo or to his descendants, confirming his identity and his connection to our family, even if the specific branch was distant. While waiting for potential DNA matches, I decided to explore another avenue of investigation. Was there any individual in the Blackwood Mill area who was known for their deep knowledge of the town's history, its families, its stories, someone who might have lived through the events of 1968 and who might be willing to share information about the fair, about any unusual occurrences, any whispers of a child being lost? I contacted the local historical society in the town nearest to Blackwood Mill again, explaining my research into a possible missing child case from the 1968 fair, and asking if they knew of any longtime residents or local historians who might have detailed memories of that period. They suggested I contact the town's former mayor, a man named Arthur Peterson, who was in his late 70s and had lived in the area his entire life. He was known for his sharp memory and his involvement in community events, including the Blackwood Mill Fair. I contacted Arthur Peterson, explaining my research into a family mystery connected to the 1968 Blackwood Mill Fair and a child who was lost. I mentioned my father's note, the child's drawing, the worn whistle, and my family's connection to the area. Mr. Peterson was initially cautious, his voice reserved, but his curiosity seemed piqued by the mention of a child lost at the fair, a story that didn't seem to be widely known or documented. He agreed to meet with me. We met in his quiet study, filled with books on local history, photographs of the town and its people. He was a kind, thoughtful man, his memory surprisingly sharp for his age. He remembered the 1968 Blackwood Mill Fair, the crowds, the excitement. He was there that day, helping with the event. When I showed him the child's drawing and the worn whistle, he examined them closely, a thoughtful expression on his face. The drawing of the fair seemed familiar to him, capturing the atmosphere of the event. The whistle, he couldn't place it specifically, but it was the kind of toy many children had at the fair. Then, I shared the story of my father's note, the mention of a child named Leo who disappeared at the fair, the uncertainty surrounding his fate, the secret that was never spoken of. Mr. Peterson listened intently, his expression growing more somber. "A child lost at the fair," Mr. Peterson said softly, his gaze distant. "Yes, I remember." Whispers. Something was said. A child. Missing. But it was quickly quieted down. Not in the papers. Not widely known. My heart leaped. He knew. He remembered the whispers, the deliberate silencing of the story. "Do you know who the child was, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Do you know anything about his family, about what happened to him?" Mr. Peterson hesitated, looking out the window, his gaze fixed on something unseen. He sighed, a long, weary sound. It was a difficult time, he said, a delicate situation. The family, they were from out of town, visiting. Something happened, something unexpected. The disappearance, it wasn't a simple case of getting lost. There were circumstances, difficult circumstances. He confirmed that the child was from out of town, visiting the fair with family. He hinted at circumstances surrounding the disappearance that were complex, perhaps even scandalous, something that warranted secrecy. The family, Mr. Peterson continued, choosing his words carefully. They wanted it kept quiet, to avoid difficulties. They left town shortly after. And the child, Leo, his story, it was buried, never spoken of openly. He was reluctant to reveal the family's name or the specific details of the circumstances, still honoring the request for secrecy that had been made over 50 years ago. But he had confirmed the core of the mystery: a child named Leo, from out of town, disappeared at the Blackwood Mill fair in 1968 due to difficult, hidden circumstances, his story deliberately silenced by his family and perhaps by others involved. "My father," I said gently. "Thomas Vance. Was he connected to this, Mr. Peterson? Did he know the family? Was he involved?" Mr. Peterson looked at me, his gaze steady. "Vance," he said. "Yes, I remember the Vance family. They were connected to the family who were visiting, distant relatives. They were at the fair that day. And yes, your father knew. He knew about the situation. He was involved in the aftermath, in ensuring the family's wishes were respected, in keeping the secret. My father knew. He was involved. He was connected to the family of the lost child, Leo. He was involved in the aftermath, in keeping the secret. The annotations in his history book, his intense research into the Miller family, from a previous search, a different mystery. But the name Miller resonated. The hidden compartment, the note, it all made sense now. My father was carrying the burden of this secret, the story of his distant relative, a child named Leo, lost at the Blackwood Mill fair due to complex, hidden circumstances. A secret he had helped to bury, a secret that haunted him for a lifetime. Chapter 4.1: Arthur Peterson's confirmation that a child named Leo, from out of town, disappeared at the Blackwood Mill fair in 1968 due to complex hidden circumstances, and that my father, Thomas Vance, was connected to the visiting family and involved in the aftermath and the keeping of the secret, brought a wave of profound sadness and a clearer understanding of the tragedy that had cast a shadow over my family for decades. My father's quiet demeanor, his hidden emotions, the subtle sadness I had sometimes sensed in him. It was the burden of this secret, the story of a child lost, a truth he had helped to bury. The child's drawing and the worn whistle were tangible links to Leo, a small boy whose life was tragically interrupted, his story deliberately silenced. The possibility that he survived, that he was simply lost to the family, raised unaware of his true identity, and the family who had grieved and kept his secret, was a powerful and emotional one. Who was Leo? What was his exact connection to my family? Arthur Peterson had mentioned that the visiting family was distantly related to the Vances. This aligned with my earlier research into distantly related families in the Blackwood Mill area. I decided to delve deeper into the family history of my Vance ancestors, focusing on the branches that had spread out over the generations and settled in the region around Blackwood Mill. I used genealogical databases, old town records, and cemetery records to trace these branches, looking for any families who had a child named Leo, born around the mid-1960s, who might have been visiting the area in the summer of 1968. This research was painstaking, requiring me to piece together fragmented information from various sources. Family trees extended over generations, branching out in different directions. I was looking for a specific child with just a first name within a large and complex family tree. Simultaneously, I continued to explore the possibility of using DNA testing to find living relatives of Leo, or even Leo himself, if he was still alive. If Leo was indeed a member of one of these distant branches of my family, a DNA match could potentially reveal a direct link to him or to his descendants, confirming his identity and his connection to our family. My DNA was in the database, and I was hoping for a match with someone who shared a significant amount of DNA, indicating a close familial relationship. While waiting for potential DNA matches, I decided to analyze the child's drawing and the worn whistle again, looking for any subtle clues that might have been overlooked. The drawing, a simple depiction of a fairground scene, felt like a personal memento, a snapshot of a happy day that ended in tragedy. The whistle, a common toy yet worn smooth with use, suggested it was a beloved possession, a comfort to a child. Was there anything unique about the whistle that I had missed? I examined it closely, looking for any brand name, any symbol, any small detail that might provide a clue to its origin or significance. There was nothing. It was a simple, worn metal whistle. The drawing, however, with its childlike depiction of the fair, felt more personal. The name Leo at the bottom, written in shaky, childlike letters, was a direct link to the lost child, the lost to us, or simply lost. In my father's note continued to resonate with a sense of profound uncertainty about Leo's fate. Was he lost to our family forever, tragically perished at the fair? Or was he simply lost in a different way, found and raised by others, unaware of his true identity and the family who had grieved and kept his story hidden? The possibility of a hidden survivor, of a life lived in anonymity, was a powerful and emotional one, a possibility that offered a glimmer of hope amidst the sadness of the mystery. I felt a growing urgency to find answers, to understand the full truth behind Leo's disappearance, to bring his story out of the shadows, and to potentially find the child who was lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. The grandfather clock, its steady ticking marking the passage of time over a secret that had been buried for decades, felt like a silent witness to the story. A story waiting to be fully told. A story that had changed everything and was never spoken of. Chapter 4.2. The Search for Leo, the child lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, was a journey through a maze of family history, local lore, and unspoken secrets. Arthur Peterson's confirmation of Leo's disappearance and my father's involvement in the aftermath and the keeping of the secret provided a framework. But the exact details of Leo's identity, his family, and his fate remained elusive. The child's drawing and the worn whistle were the only tangible links to a past that was deliberately buried. My research into the distantly related Vance families in the Blackwood Mill area continued. I was casting a wide net, searching for any familial link, any potential connection that might shed light on Leo's identity and his presence at the fair in 1968. Families with the same surname or related surnames who lived in the Blackwood Mill area in the mid to late 1960s were my focus. While I was immersed in genealogical research, the DNA results began to come in from the distantly related cousins who had submitted their samples. Each notification sparked a wave of anticipation. Would one of these matches lead me closer to Leo? Then, an email notification from the DNA database. A close match. A predicted relationship. Second cousin. The person was listed as Leo P. Second cousin. Leo P. The degree of relationship, second cousin, meant we shared a set of great-grandparents. This confirmed that Leo P. was a member of one of those distantly related branches of my family, a branch that shared a set of great-grandparents with me. The initial P in his name suggested his last name began with P. Could this Leo P. be the lost child Leo from the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968? His age would align, as a second cousin relationship suggests individuals in roughly the same generation or one generation apart. The possibility felt immense, overwhelming. Could this Leo P. be the child my father had kept a secret about for decades? Could he be the child lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair? I clicked on Leo P.'s profile in the DNA database. He had a public profile with some information about his family tree. His age was listed as 61, consistent with being born around 1963 or 1964, which would make him around 4 or 5 years old in 1968, a plausible age for a child's disappearance at a fair. His location was listed as being in a different state, several hours away. His family tree listed his parents, now deceased, and some siblings. His last name was Peterson. Leo Peterson, second cousin, born around 1963 to 1964. Could he be Leo, the lost child? The predicted relationship, second cousin, felt slightly off if he was the child of a first cousin. However, predicted relationships in DNA can sometimes be inaccurate, especially for more distant connections. Or perhaps the familial connection was slightly more complex than initially anticipated. I decided to send a message to Leo Peterson through the DNA database. I introduced myself, explaining my research into a family mystery connected to the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968 and a child named Leo who was lost there. I mentioned my father, Thomas Vance, and his connection to the area. I shared the information about my father's note, the child's drawing, and the worn whistle, hoping these details would resonate with him, spark a memory, a sense of a forgotten past. I was careful not to reveal the full extent of my belief that he might be that child initially, wanting to approach the sensitive topic gently. Sending that message felt like a leap into the unknown, a moment of releasing a truth that had been buried for over 50 years, a truth that could potentially change a man's understanding of his entire life. The waiting period was filled with intense anticipation and a mix of hope and dread. How would he react? Would he know anything about the Blackwood Mill Fair? About a disappearance? About a hidden past? Then a reply. A message from Leo Peterson. Clara, I received your message. Blackwood Mill Fair? 1968? Lost child named Leo? Yes, those names, they resonate with me. My parents. They never spoke much about their past, especially my early years. There was always a sense of something unspoken, a hidden sadness. And the Blackwood Mill Fair? It was a place they avoided, always. I was born in 1964. My parents adopted me as an infant. They were always open about that. But they knew very little about my biological family, about my origins. I've done some searching myself, but the adoption records are sealed. The drawing, the whistle. Can you tell me more about them? They stir something within me, a feeling of familiarity, of a forgotten past. I would like to talk, Clara, very much. I think you might have some answers I've been searching for my entire life. My heart pounded. Adopted, born in 1964. A sense of something unspoken, a hidden sadness in his adoptive parents. Avoiding the Blackwood Mill Fair. The drawing, the whistle stirring a feeling of familiarity. He was the child. Leo. My father's lost relative. Lost at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. Found and raised by another family. Unaware of his true origins. Unaware of the family who had kept his story hidden for over 50 years. Chapter 5.1. The message from Leo Peterson, confirming his adoption, his birth in 1964, his adoptive parents avoiding the Blackwood Mill Fair, and the drawing and whistle stirring a feeling of familiarity was the confirmation I had been searching for. He was the child, Leo, the lost child of the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968. He was my second cousin, separated from our family by a tragic event and a secret that had been kept for over 50 years. My father's haunting note, lost to us, or simply lost, now held a profound clarity. He was simply lost to us, found and raised by another family. His identity and his connection to his original family concealed by adoption and time. My task now was to share the full story of his origins with Leo, to connect him with his biological family, to bring him home to the history that had been hidden from him for 60 years. It was a delicate and emotionally charged process, a responsibility I approached with immense care and sensitivity. We talked on the phone, sharing our stories, filling in the gaps of our separate lives. I shared with him the story of the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, the disappearance of a child named Leo, my father's note, the child's drawing, the worn whistle. I shared my research into the possibility of a child being found, rescued, and adopted after the fair, a child who was lost to his original family. I shared the DNA match, the predicted second cousin relationship, and the confirmation that he was indeed connected to my Vance family, to the distantly related branch that had lived in the Blackwood Mill area. Leo listened, his voice filled with emotion. The story resonated with him, filling in the blanks of a past he had always sensed was hidden. The drawing and the whistle, those tangible links to a forgotten childhood, brought a wave of memories, fragmented and unclear, but undeniably his. He remembered a fair, a big tree, bright colors, a sense of excitement, and then confusion, fear, the kindness of strangers. We arranged to meet in person. The day I met Leo Peterson, the man who was once the lost child of the Blackwood Mill Fair, the man who was my second cousin, was a moment of profound emotional intensity. We stood there, two strangers connected by blood and a shared history, a history that had been buried for over 50 years. We visited the old Blackwood Mill site together, the place where Leo was last seen as a child. The overgrown fields, the quiet woods, they were no longer just a place of past tragedy, but a place of connection, of understanding. Leo walked the grounds, a sense of familiarity in his steps, memories stirring, fragments of a childhood lost in time. We talked about the circumstances of his disappearance, the uncertainty surrounding that day. Was it a simple case of a child wandering off? Was something more complex involved? My father's note hinted at difficult circumstances, a truth that was never spoken of. The possibility that Leo was not simply lost in the crowd, but that his disappearance was somehow connected to a difficult family situation, a crisis, or even a deliberate act to separate him from his original family, lingered. Arthur Peterson's hint at circumstances in a family wanting to avoid difficulties supported this. The focus shifted to understanding what truly happened the day Leo disappeared, and the reasons behind the secret that had been kept for so long. Who was with Leo at the fair? What happened immediately before he went missing? And who was involved in the decision to keep his story hidden, to let the world believe he was simply lost, or worse? The process of uncovering the full truth, of understanding the motivations behind the secrecy, was a complex and emotionally challenging one, requiring us to delve deeper into the history of Leo's original family and the events of that fateful day in 1968. Chapter 5.2: The journey to uncover the truth behind Leo's disappearance at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, sparked by a hidden compartment in a grandfather clock, had led to the extraordinary discovery of my lost second cousin, a child who was not lost to the flood, but simply lost to our family, his life taking a different path, his existence concealed by adoption and time. Meeting Leo, connecting with him as a relative, was a profound experience, a fulfillment of a search I hadn't even known I was on until I found my father's hidden note. Leo, raised by his loving adoptive parents, the Petersons. My earlier research had identified the adoptive family as foster, but subsequent conversations and DNA confirmations with Leo confirmed the name Peterson had lived a full and meaningful life. He was a kind, thoughtful man, deeply loved by his own family. The knowledge of his biological origins, while initially overwhelming, provided him with answers, with a sense of completeness, a deeper understanding of who he was and where he came from. He was not angry at his biological family. He understood that the circumstances of his disappearance and the subsequent adoption were likely complex, born of difficult choices and perhaps a desire to provide him with a better life. Our relationship as newly found second cousins was a gift, a bond that transcended the years of separation and the secrets that had kept us apart. We were connected by blood and by a shared history, a history that had been buried for over 50 years. We spent time together, sharing stories, filling in the gaps of our separate lives. We talked about his biological family, about the parents he never knew, the circumstances that led to his being left behind at the fair, the mystery of what truly happened the day Leo disappeared at the Blackwood Mill Fair in 1968, the difficult circumstances my father and Arthur Peterson had hinted at remained an ongoing part of our investigation. Was it a simple accident, a child wandering off in a crowd? Or was something more complex involved? Was there a family crisis, a difficult decision made in the moment, or even a deliberate act that led to his being left behind? The child's drawing and the worn whistle, the only tangible links to that day, held a silent testimony to a happy moment that preceded a profound loss. Leo remembered flashes, fragments of memories connected to the drawing and the whistle, feelings of excitement and then confusion, fear, the kindness of strangers. The truth, it was never spoken of. In my father's note, the deliberate silence surrounding Leo's disappearance suggested that the full story was known to my father and others involved, and that it was a truth they chose to conceal. We continued to research the events of the 1968 Blackwood Mill Fair, looking for any further clues, any inconsistencies in the limited records, any witnesses who might have a more complete memory of that day. We also delved deeper into the history of Leo's biological family, the branch of the Vance family distantly related to me, looking for any information about their lives, any difficulties they might have been facing in 1968, any circumstances that might explain Leo's disappearance and subsequent adoption. The complexity of the secret was immense, revealing layers of hidden pain, difficult choices, and a family's attempt to cope with a crisis in the shadows. It wasn't just about a child getting lost. It was about a story that was deliberately buried, a truth that was kept silent for over 50 years, shaping lives in ways we were only now beginning to understand. The grandfather clock in my hall, its steady ticking, marking the passage of time, was no longer just a timepiece. It was a symbol of a hidden history, a testament to a child lost and found, a reminder that even when time passes and secrets are kept, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, bringing with it the possibility of healing, of understanding, and of a family finding its way back to a form of wholeness, embracing its hidden branches and the lives that were shaped by the unpredictable hand of fate. My life, which began with a father's cherished clock and a hidden compartment, had been profoundly changed. I had uncovered a hidden branch of our family tree connected with a second cousin I never knew existed, a cousin who was the lost child of the Blackwood Mill Fair. The journey was ongoing as Leo and I continued to piece together the full story of his biological family and the events of 1968. But we faced the future together, two relatives brought together by a shared history and a father's secret chime. A chime that had finally revealed a truth that was lost, but not forgotten.